One.
Hello, welcome everyone to our event today from Local to Global, Saving Animals and Humans Across the Globe in International Disasters. I'm delighted to be welcoming you as Director of the Global Research Network. We're a non-profit organization running a think tank. Well, it's a member-run think tank with hundreds of researchers from around the world who come together to collaborate on projects that have real social impact. The programs we run are available on our website. It's www.grn.global. If you have any interest in joining, do have a look at the projects that we've been running and the events, such as this wonderful one that we're hosting today, and consider joining up. I'll hand over now to Altamush Saeed, who's the coordinator of this and facilitating our discussion today. And welcome, get a cup of coffee, and we look forward to hearing all the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adamo. Hi, everybody. My name is Altamush Saeed. I'm a junior fellow at the Animals and Biodiversity think tank at the Global Research Network. And I welcome all of you to this event titled From Local to Global, Saving Animals and Humans Across the Globe in International Disasters. The idea behind this event is we are originally planning to have more of these expert panel discussions over this topic on every year, actually. And just to begin and give you a background about the event, and because we are approaching this event and other future events from a point of view of questions, and the main area that we are very interested in knowing more about is what are disasters? Are they natural? Like, if they can be predicted and therefore we can prepare, how much do we have to prevent them or at least exponentially reduce the risk? If they are not natural but are rather caused by anthropocentric factors such as factory farming, can the harm in a disaster be reduced through rescue and capacity building? Also, how should we frame a disaster protection frameworks that is devoid of anthropocentrism, where humans and animals' needs are equally met in disasters? What should our solutions be? Is it an animal-specific protection matrix to an international treaty, or what else? So I'm approaching this expert panel from a lot of questions, and whenever I was, trying to write the background about this event, I actually wanted to mention the recent disasters that had happened. And unfortunately, there have been 4 disasters in September alone, and 1 now in October. And to just give you a short background or a brief of why conversations like these are really important is I want to mention to the people about the major disaster that happened in February and March, which was an earthquake of a 7.8 magnitude in Turkey, which led to the death of 51,000 humans. Unfortunately, since there was no policy for recording animal deaths, we don't know how many animals died in that event. Then there were the Canada wildfires, which basically led to the burning of over 27.1 million acres of land just in this year. And they were over at a certain point in July, around 600 active fires happening. And then, unfortunately, there were these Maui, Hawaii wildfires, which actually have been one of the major ones. And since 2000, the US, unfortunately, has had over 72,400 wildfires. And these fires have burned an average of 7 million acres of land annually, twice as much as was annually burned during the 1990s. To move forward, another disaster that happened in September alone was the Libya floods. And these happened due to dam collapse. And because there were no warning systems available to guide the people away from this disaster could actually have been prevented. And it led to an unfortunate death of 11,300 people. And again, we have no data of how many animals died because there is no such policy for that. Lastly, in September 8th, there was another earthquake in Morocco, which led to the deaths of 2,900 people. And unfortunately, on October 7th, there was another earthquake in Afghanistan, which led to the deaths of 2,000 people and hurt over 1,200 people and led to the destruction of 1,300 houses. This is just in 2023 alone. Disasters are unfortunately no longer an event that happens annually, but it's monthly, and if not, if we talk about September, then it's actually uh, a weekly occurrence. And with this background, we basically open this panel. And again, in no order of preference, I would like to introduce our esteemed speakers today. Uh, our speaker from India is Varnika Singh, who is the head of legal affairs at Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations. She has an experience over 13 years and is a prominent figure in animal law, serving as the head of legal affairs at FIAPO. She specializes in animal protection and has been actively involved in high-profile litigation cases such as street dog rights, Jallikattu, and the banning of animals in circuses. She has been instrumental in related dairy management, ensuring compliance with animal welfare regulations. Her expertise extend beyond the courtroom, supporting her team in filing FIRs and providing legal training. She is currently pursuing an LLM in animal law at Lewis and Clark Law School. Varnika, thank you so much for joining us today. Our next esteemed speaker is Beth Eggleston, who is the co-founder of a humanitarian advisory group from Australia. Beth holds a Master of Development Studies and was awarded the Humanitarian Overseas Service Medal by the Australian government in 2011. She specializes in civil military coordination and humanitarian reform, working with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Afghanistan to develop civil military guidance policy on interaction with provincial reconstruction teams. Beth co-founded Humanitarian Advisory Group, a social enterprise based in Melbourne in 2012 and still remains a director. She's a Fulbright scholar and has spent time at the US Naval War College, where she undertook research with the Humanitarian Response Program. Beth, thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your knowledge. Our next esteemed speaker is Dr. Steve Blassie, who is an international award-winning emergency manager with a number of specialties, including animal disaster management. He was selected as a subject matter expert on the topic for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia and Routledge Handbook on Animal Welfare. He has an experience over 30 years and has risen to positions such as Director of Training, Performance, and Governance at the County Fire Authority in Victoria, Australia. He's an associate professor and director at Central Queensland University and a general manager at Emergency Management and Business Continuity at New Zealand's largest government department, the Ministry of Social Development, disaster management officer with the UN, and the chief executive officer of the Emergency Management Academy of New Zealand. In 2008, he was awarded with the prestigious Certified Emergency Manager credentials and remains one of the many few in the world to have these credentials. Thank you, Dr. Steve Blassie, for joining us today. Our next esteemed speaker is Amanda Lamont, who is also from Australia and is a disaster resilience advisor, climate change storyteller, firefighter, emergency volunteer, world explorer, writer, photographer, and a public speaker with over 30 years of experience. She has held senior roles in government INGOs, not-for-profit, and corporate enterprises. She is also co-founder of the Australasian Women in Emergency Networks and has been involved in a variety of paid volunteer roles on developing strategies and supporting people before, during, and after disasters. On the front line of an escalating disaster landscape and biodiversity crisis exacerbated by climate change, Amanda's professional and personal experiences have led her to establish nature-based resilience, acting as an environmental advocate in disaster planning and igniting a movement in the connection to nature to build collective human and ecological resilience. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today. And finally, our last esteemed speaker is Kelly Donathan from the US, who's the director of Humane Society International Global Animal Disaster Response Program. She holds a BS in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Arizona and an MS in conservation medicine from Tufts Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. She began her career as an animal care specialist at White Oak Conservation, working with a variety of endangered species. Following graduate school, she worked with the International Fund for Animal Welfare, first as a policy analyst, then as a wildlife rescue program officer. She's an alumna of Class 5 of the Emerging Wildlife Conservation Leaders Program, during which she co-founded the Painted Dog Protection Initiative. In 2015, Kelly worked as the bear manager at Animals Asia Vietnam Bear Rescue Center, caring for nearly 200 amazing bears and rescuing them from the bio trade. Returning to the US in 2017, she worked as an independent consultant for wildlife conservation and animal welfare organizations while pursuing a certificate in sustainability and behavior change from the University of California. She briefly worked at World Animal Protection as their exotic pets campaign manager before joining HSI, and has responded to disasters around the world, including wildfires, cyclones, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. And to go about with the order presentations, in no order preference, we will be going actually with the chronological order, and I will actually offer the floor to Amanda to talk about her work and to share her knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you. And have I got the ability to share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, it says only the host, so can you change that? Can you give me sharing options? I don't have, it's not coming up.
It should be all participants. Are you still unable to share?
Yeah. Perhaps, does somebody else want to go first and then we can fix that up in the background so we don't waste time?
I'm happy to do that if that's helpful.
Yeah, sure, we can do that. I'll offer the floor to Beth first, and then we'll come back to Amanda. Thank
No
you.
problem.
Thank you, Beth.
Amanda. We can tic-tac, it'll be all right. All right, let's see if I can share my screen here. Let's see.
Mine, I've got mine now if you want me to. Okay, cool.
Okay, no, let's go with you, Amanda. Let me just stop sharing. Great.
Oh, good start. Excellent start, everybody.
It's good to get that out the way. Now we'll be smooth sailing.
Yay! How are we looking? Is that okay? Does that look good to everyone?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Fabulous. Well, let's keep moving along. Now, I understand this is a think tank, not a teach tank. So I'm going to start with a couple of ideas for us to think about throughout the course of this presentation. Some people are so poor, all they have is money. And when we talk about nature, environment, conservation, and animals in a disaster context, I think it's really important to remember that a lot of the things that we report on, value, focus on, are not often the things that we really value when we lose them. So keep this in the back of your head as we move through this presentation. Another thing to keep in the back of your head is this can be a pretty black and dark and gloomy topic. So I always like to approach conversations around disasters and climate change with belief, curiosity, and trust. Now, I used to say hope, curiosity, and trust, but after becoming a total Ted Lasso fan, I've decided that belief is better than hope. So now I want us to believe that anything is possible, be curious about how to do it, and trust that everyone is in this for the right reasons. So let's be positive as we work through some pretty depressing concepts like this one, climate change, of course. Known as the greatest existential threat of our time. You might recognize this image. It was taken in the 70s from NASA. It was as they were returning to Earth. It's the first time we saw Earth all at once together. And it's said to have changed the way we think about our home, our planet, realizing that we all live on this place and that we all have a responsibility to care for it and look after it as our home. Strategically placed the rotation with Australia there in the forefront, being a very patriotic Australian. So climate change, look, there's a long list of things in this slide: political instability, floods, bushfires, storms, extreme heat events, changing sea level, temperature of the ocean, wind movements and patterns. We know all of this. We know that climate change is changing the planet. It's also driving more extreme, frequent and severe disaster landscapes. Really interesting, the last one on that list to point out, our way of life. Our way of life is potentially going to be fundamentally changed, dare I say, has changed the way that we live because of all of these things, not just the direct impacts, but the cascading and flow-on consequences of climate change. So I don't know whether you've seen this before, but this really struck me, this image. Remember COVID? Remember we thought it was the biggest thing ever we were going to experience in our lifetime. And if you can't see it there in the comment bubble, be sure to wash your hands and all will be well. So we thought COVID was a big thing. But on the back of COVID, we started talking about a global financial economic recession. And this was actually going to cause us more pain, trauma and suffering. But then, of course, as COVID drifted off and the financial crisis looked like it wasn't going to peak, we now are really focused on climate change. To think about all of those things that we thought were really fundamentally life-changing, and to know that the collapse of our biodiversity globally is going to be an even bigger impact on all of us over our lifetimes. And there's that comment from David Attenborough, what we do now and in the next few years will profoundly affect the next few thousand years and, dare I say, our lifetime. So biodiversity is an important part of the conversation that we have to have. We can't just keep talking about climate change in isolation around reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the impact on humans. We need to think about that beautiful blue marble planet that we all live on. Imagine this, imagine on our watch this century that we risk losing up to 50% of all land-based species. Can you believe that? That's phenomenal. That is a huge thing to comprehend. And this, interestingly, is a statistic that comes from an economics paper. So to think that in our lifetime, because of climate change, because of human impacts, that we could potentially lose half of land-based species that we live alongside. And we don't necessarily know the impacts of that on our lives. So we know that climate change is threatening species in multiple and complex ways. And yes, this talk is about animals in a disaster context, but I'm going to specifically focus on wildlife in the environment. So we're looking at habitat loss, changing environmental thresholds, so air temperature, water getting too hot beyond which species can survive in, changes of species interactions, they're no longer cross-pollinating and species aren't meeting where they normally would, species are moving south away from the equator. How's that going to change ecosystems and interactions? Destruction of ecosystem, loss of homes, direct loss of animals as a result of climate change, heat events, and of course the direct impacts of disasters like bushfires, floods and storms. And then new species being introduced into the environment like disease, which impacts on the really complex and incredibly fragile ecosystem that we all live in. So specifically in Australia, we had our first mammal extinction due to climate change. As a direct result of climate change, we lost the beautiful brambleclay melomus in the Great Barrier Reef. It lost its home in a tiny island in the north of Australia because of sea level rises. And then you can just see all around Australia, we are seeing the impacts of climate change on our species. We see heat events knocking budgerigars out of the sky. We're seeing heating oceans, which are changing the way that the sea turtles in the north of Australia are breeding. The hotter the water, the more likelihood it is we're going to have female turtles that are born. Imagine a future where no male turtles are born, we're all females. We lose that species. We're seeing mass fish deaths in the Murray-Darling Basin. We're seeing the bogong moth's flight patterns changing, critical food source for the pygmy possum in the alpine ranges, they go extinct. We're seeing the alpine zone losing its snow. So we're seeing all around Australia, on land and off land, changes in climate, changing the way that these species interact and are able to live. So here's just some specific examples. Warming temperatures impact our beautiful platypus. I talked about the sea turtles. 99% of young green sea turtles are now female. The bats fall out of the trees in the hot weather events that we have in Australia. And of course, koalas not only suffering directly through bushfires, but really struggle in the heat. And you go on reasonably mild days to zoos now and you see that always the sprinklers are on cooling down the koalas because they have a low tolerance to heat. Now, I probably don't need to tell you about the disasters in Australia. Here's just an example of our disaster landscape in the last 4 years. we get impacted by bushfires, floods, and storms. We also have a wet season and a cyclone season. We've had tsunami warnings, we've had earthquakes. So all of these things are impacting on us in Australia. And if you saw the timeline of these events throughout the year, these events more and more are overlapping. And can I just mention that in the last couple of weeks, we had bushfires here in Victoria, and the very next day, those same areas that were under bushfire threat were under flood alert. So one day we had the bushfire map indicating where homes and property was potentially going to be lost. And the very next day, those areas were under flood. When we talked about cascading events, we never really imagined it was going to be the very next day. So we are really suffering the extremes of temperature, and it's really not much of a stretch of the imagination to see the impacts this is going to have, yes, on people, but also on wildlife. And also, just to mention, livestock and pets are a really key part of our emergency management landscape. But as I said, I'm going to focus on wildlife. So here are some comments made in our Royal Commission into the National Natural Disasters following the 2019 and 20 bushfires in Australia, which I'm sure you're aware of. Did you know that we have really unique species in Australia? 7 to 10% of the species here in Australia are not found anywhere else on Earth. So this is something we really need to value here in Australia. Remember, some people are so poor, all they have is money. What do we really value? So our ecosystems are under increasing strain because of the disaster landscape brought about by climate change. So this ecological disaster that we saw in 2019 and 20, you can see the statistics at the top of the screen. Billions of reptiles, millions of birds and mammals and frogs that lived in those areas that were impacted by those bushfires. And I haven't written this down. It might be anecdotal. It's anecdotal because we don't really know about invertebrates. But one of our experts in Australia has suggested that potentially 30% of invertebrates in the southeast of Victoria went extinct during those bushfires. So this really is a crisis of an astronomical scale with respect to our ecosystem and our biodiversity. So in my journey in emergency management, I've had lots of different roles. I've worked mainly with people at national, state and local level and at the grassroots. After the bushfires, I actually got a really interesting role at Zoos Victoria as the Climate Action Disaster Resilience Advisor. And my job there was to support Zoos Victoria in their planning in response to those bushfires. So there was a lot of stuff that happened with wildlife, and there wasn't necessarily a plan, but actually the organisations like zoos and wildlife welfare organisations rallied really well and did some phenomenal things. And I want to talk about the eastern bristlebird extraction. There are 800 of these species that are existing in this fire footprint area, half of them in Victoria and half across the border in New South Wales. It just so happened that one day a woman was in the office, saw the fire footprint and realised that a critical population of those birds that were on the extinction list were in the path of the bushfire. Some phone calls were made and everyone rallied together in a very short space of time. Permits were issued and a crew was dropped into the front of the fire zone, and they were able to collect 15 of those birds in a couple of days before they had to move out because the fire was approaching. We had the Defence Force and the Fisheries Department, and those birds were relocated to Zoos Victoria where they were looked after until they could be returned back into their home in that population. So when we talk about evacuation, we often think about people, but to understand that there is some really concerted efforts now going into evacuation of threatened species that are in the path of these disasters and bushfires. Phenomenal effort, but it was sort of by chance. So a lot of work in the background now is to put plans in place to make sure that we don't helicopter people in at the last minute, that we actually have plans to make sure that we protect in place, evacuate out, or make sure that we have insurance populations. And you will have seen this on the news, but there was an incredible amount of work in the animal triage and koala care. So looking after the koalas that were impacted in those bushfires, rehabilitating them sometimes up to 12 months and returning them. So what Zoos Victoria saw was that their role in disasters was really important, working alongside partners to ensure that threatened species didn't go extinct as a result of a disaster after 20 years of work of trying to protect them from extinction. And really importantly, that people were trained in the future for the wildlife disasters. So zoos, as I said, seeing a lot more of their role that they have to play. The Zoos Victoria has a really strong statement on climate change, not only as an organisation, but really rallying resources around its threatened species program, protection of habitat, and ensuring the welfare of wildlife, both in properties and in the wildlife. I was authored the Zoos Victoria Wildlife Emergency Management Arrangements. So now Zoos Victoria has a really substantial document which outlines its arrangements of how it will mobilise and respond in the face of future disasters. And really important there was understanding the impacts of climate change on the disaster landscape. So in our Royal Commission, some findings were found with respect to animals generally and specific wildlife. In Australia, wildlife are managed by national, state and local governments, and the recommendations were that we really needed to consolidate and integrate some of our legislation so that they spoke to each other more easily. That we needed to do some training, particularly around spontaneous volunteers and people that want to go and help wildlife, and also train emergency service responders who don't necessarily know best care and management of wildlife in disasters. And really importantly, greater consistency and collaboration on the collection of data about the critical species in Australian flora and fauna. So this is a think, not a teach, but there are a lot of resources that you can find really easily about how the emergency management landscape is managed in Australia, particularly with respect to animals and wildlife. So really quickly to finish up, I feel like there was a bit of a gap when I moved from a people-focused disaster response and resilience role into an environmental role. And I realised that we weren't prioritising the environment and animals enough in our emergency management plans. Here's an example in Victoria of our state emergency management priorities. Yay, we're on the list. Protection of environment and conservation assets. Boo, we're last on the list. But what I say to people, it's not either life and relief of suffering or animals. My advocacy point and my pitch is that we can do all of these things. We are smart enough and we don't have to choose. So we are on the list with respect to animals and the environment. So we have a responsibility to protect them all in our planning, and there's a lot more we can do. So we tend to think of ourselves as humans at the top of the apex, above all the other species, in control of everything, and we come first. I'd like us to reimagine where we sit in our ecosystem. This is their model, and I've suggested maybe they want to adapt the model to include value, because we don't know what the risk is until we understand what we value. And I believe that we should be putting more value on wildlife, the environment, our ecosystems and biodiversity. It's in the Sustainable Development Goals. We're seeing huge movements with the UNDIR towards understanding nature-based solutions and the important role of nature in protecting us. So nature-based resilience, we need to look after nature and it will look after us. It's critical. So I wish lots of things for our future, and it's all about looking after each other, having the knowledge and wisdom of our ancestors and our ancient ancestors, working together, partnering, changing minds and hearts about the important role of nature, environment, wildlife and animals in our disaster planning. And don't forget, belief, curiosity and trust. Thank you very much. There are my contact details. I was a little bit over, sorry.
No, that was insightful and it was perfect. Thank you so much for the work that you do and the work that you will do. So thank you so much for both of those. And I will now move forward in no order of preference, in chronological order, over to Beth.
Thank you so much. I'll just get my screen working. Just to make you feel good, Amanda, that you weren't the only one who... It's coming. Here we are. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Amanda. It's great to hear your insights, and I hope to build on a couple of those. And before I begin, I wanted to touch on what Amanda just mentioned on about our ancestors, and wanted to acknowledge the traditional lands on which I'm joining you from tonight, of the Dja Dja Wurrung people north of Melbourne. And the reason I wanted to bring that up in particular is to talk about again, some of that traditional knowledge, and this is so critical when it comes to looking at the environment and protecting wildlife and other animals, and really living in harmony with those when it comes to preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. In Australia, this is very well known, the fact that there is such a massively long history of more than 70,000 years of ongoing care of the environment and knowledge of animals and how humans and animals live together. But, and sorry, Amanda, that I had to bring this up, but it had to be done. Sadly, we do not value this in the way that we should, in my humble opinion. Amanda and I have just gone through a referendum this past weekend in which that recognition of that knowledge and care for the land, unfortunately, has not been valued and embraced in the way that many of us would have hoped to see. So we must find other ways. Today, what I would like to talk to you about is the way in which the international disaster response system, in many different contexts, what that looks like, how we're responding, and also to highlight to you some of the research that we've been doing around the way in which we can green the humanitarian system. The very way in which we respond to disasters should also ensure that we are treading gently on the environment and protecting animals and humans as we go. So I've got the same picture here as Amanda. Just shows how very well coordinated we are. And I just wanted to reiterate what Amanda was saying around the impact that some of the disasters we've seen, not just in Australia, but across the world, the massive impact that they've had, particularly in the Black Summer fires in Australia. We saw more than 3 billion animals either killed or displaced through those emergencies. So I wanted to focus on the fact that disasters, wildfires, earthquakes and others have been really catastrophic. But I also wanted to touch on a couple of other contexts. So in terms of the conflict piece, I mean, sadly, we can't even turn on the television at the moment without seeing what we are doing to each other across the globe. And I think this is a piece that we don't often hear a lot about. So these are all pictures of responses in Ukraine. And I think what's really interesting here is seeing not only the numbers, like thousands and thousands and thousands, and this is really looking at animals, part of people's family who are being evacuated and moving on with different families. But the incredibly important part we have here about the role that animals have played in the psychosocial support of people as they're being displaced, as they're going through the trauma of conflict. So I think understanding how we respond to these type of crises is really important as well. And this is just a very small part. Obviously, that the part in terms of the well-being of livestock has been a huge part in terms of these type of conflicts where you've run out of power and water, and many animals have been left to suffer. So that's been quite catastrophic. The pandemic, an interesting one here. As you would know, during the pandemic, family violence was something that went through the roof. And it's been really interesting to see there was a statistic in one particular shelter in Victoria that 53% of women who accessed that shelter said that their family pets had also been harmed in terms of family violence. So this is perhaps a crisis we may not think of animals being severely impacted, but that's definitely one as well. Also, one that you may have thought about as well is the nuclear piece. This is a disaster we don't think of that often. However, it's something that really should be at the forefront. Unfortunately, the way in which certain conflicts are going, there is a possibility we may need to face this. So I think being able to understand this is a really beautiful story about a Japanese man who went back to his farm and actually cared for not just the animals on his farm, but many other abandoned animals after the Fukushima crisis, and understanding how these kind of human-induced crises also are having a huge effect on animals. So the way in which we respond to crises actually really matters. So all of you would have seen that when you have a large emergency, be that a conflict or a disaster situation, that a lot of communities would like to give goods to that particular crisis. There's been a lot of advocacy now to try and allow people to understand that often giving cash is best, and then that cash can be used to support both animals and humans, and you're not seeing a lot of this stuff that just goes to landfill. It ends up clogging up logistic hubs when it's coming into countries. It takes a lot of people hours to sort, and then sometimes you can even cause community tensions in the way that it may be distributed, because it's provided in an ad hoc way. So although people are very well meaning, I think more advocacy needs to be done around this piece. Some of the research we've been doing has really been looking at some of the harm that humanitarian response can have on the environment, and which has a knock-on effect, obviously, for both animals and for humans. So we're looking at a lot to do with the pollution of fresh water sources, a lot also to do with waste and plastic. And this, and of course, don't get me wrong, this is through a situation where people's coping mechanisms and their access to other resources have been depleted because of a disaster or because of conflict. So we see people needing to access, and the clearing of land, for example, or the access of water, which is actually having an impact that's going to really impact on generations down the line, and is going to have some very, impacts that are going to ensure that people who are, moving, displaced, if people are going to be displaced, their coping mechanisms are undermined straight away, and those mechanisms are going to have a knock-on effect for the environment. So what should we do about that? When we come to looking at greening humanitarian action, what are we actually talking about there? And it's something we need to be able to measure. We need to be able to demonstrate that we're taking action to respond in ways in which, as I mentioned, are treading more gently on the earth. So we've been doing some thinking about this, and we're trying to actually come up with a framework that humanitarian agencies can use. And really, it's based around these kind of issues. And these are things that you would all know. It really builds on what Amanda was saying about how we're approaching and really addressing climate action. But these are really practical ways in which we'd like to see humanitarian agencies really not see these just as a nice to have, but are actually critical to the way in which they operate. So it's really around, so I'll give you the example of water, for example, and waste. In some of the responses to cyclones in the Pacific, we're seeing that the numbers of bottles of water being sent to some of these countries, in the recent response to the tsunami in Tonga, more than 84,000 bottles of water were sent in there. So trying to work out how can we use desalination or other kind of ways of providing water to crisis affected people and animals that are not going to be having this impact that's going to have a long-term negative impact. So in terms of doing that, it all sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? But what are some of the barriers and enablers? So in terms of the barriers, unfortunately, you may hear people who work for humanitarian agencies often say, I'm too busy saving lives to think about the environment. And this is something that we need to really overcome. And the fact that it's seen as an additional burden that organisations have to deal with, it's seen as very aspirational and not something that's seen as possible. So we need to change that. Also, there's very much a gap between the policy and the practice. There is some great thinking out there, but it's not something that's built into every response. Also, power dynamics, and this links into what I was saying about First Nations people and really valuing the knowledge of local organisations. Often local organisations, they're not in the driver's seat and they're not involved in making decisions. And this is something that needs to change if we're going to see success here. And when we're talking about the enablers, though, and again, I want to be positive about how things are shifting, I think actually the humanitarian sector is being able to see some positive examples, both from the public and the private sectors, when it comes to environmental work. There's also some strong evidence now, which is hopefully moving the dial and changing behaviour, because the the evidence and the statistics is there about why we need to do this and why it actually provides a better response in the first place. And also there's complementary agendas. I mean, I'm sure many of you who are involved in the space are also looking at how we can have an inclusive response. How can we ensure that we're seeing localization, so locally led response? How are we seeing modalities like cash being used more often? And also accountability to those very communities that are impacted by these disasters. So that's a really important and key part there. So really our research is looking for a greener humanitarian system that saves lives today and tomorrow. It's not just about what's happening in the moment. We must look at how both animals and humans are impacted as we're responding to a crisis, because we can exacerbate and make things worse. So there, we're really wanting to take that principled humanitarian action and ensure we're able to apply that in a broader sense. From a very operational sense, many of you will be aware of the cluster approach. That is how the international humanitarian system works. And from there, we're really trying to look at what are the kind of environmental impacts that those different clusters or those different sectors have. So it could be everything from how people are cooking in refugee camps. It's looking at how you're going to be keeping people warm. How do you move people around? How do you keep people safe in the various, they may be displaced, or the various communities that they're living in. So you can see it's quite a practical approach. And just a quick example from the recent volcanic eruption and tsunami in Tonga, there were some really positive things that happened there. So we're also looking at really trying to understand what anticipatory action looks like there. And again, is that the evacuation of animals and people, but it's also pre-positioning stock. It's ensuring that there are cash-based programming that can happen. It's leveraging and understanding and respecting traditional knowledge and wisdom. It's ensuring that communities are able to be in the driver's seat, that they were accountable to them and they are able to make decisions. There's a great example of how communities were able to go out and collect a huge amount of single-use plastic and bring that in. This was all done by communities after the tsunami happened. It was brought in, it was compacted by support by the New Zealand and Australian governments, and it was actually put on some of the Australian Defence Force ships. And the thing I would say is on the adaptation piece, I think we talk a lot about different programs and how we can do climate change adaptation, but also adaptation to some of the actual physical impacts of disasters. So the picture on the left is in Tonga after that volcanic eruption, and areas that have been impacted by ashfall, where animals and humans are not able to live at the moment because of that. How do we adapt to that? How do we get and support communities to be able to support animal and wildlife populations and ecosystems? And the other picture here is also looking at coral reefs after earthquakes, where you're seeing incredible sort of tectonic shifts and uplift of reefs. What happens to some of these ecosystems when they've been exposed to these huge shifts? And how do we work differently, tread gently, and really try and ensure that we're custodians and stewardships of these really fragile environments? Thank you very much. I'll leave that there and we can get on to the next speaker.
Beth, thank you so much for that. Just to summarize, just want to say one line. Our inability to value nature is the reason we have disasters. That was what Amanda said. Our inability to value nature in disasters, we actually are causing more disasters. And that's why I think we really need a green humanitarian response. So that was a perfect rendition. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. I apologize, I didn't mean chronological order, I meant alphabetical order. So the next person is Kelly.
Okay, I'm hoping you can all hear me okay. It's such an honor to be here, and thank you so much for having me as part of this panel. Amanda and Beth, you have already set the bar with some really incredibly inspiring and interesting things that we all need to be considering during this in this work in disaster management. And while my title refers to disaster response, I really want to talk about beyond the response and what we do before something happens and long after, while response still remains a big part of our work. So why do we consider animals in disasters? And I think obviously most of us here already have a pretty good understanding of why why animals, be it companion animals or livestock, wildlife, are important when discussing disaster management. And for one thing, we really feel at the Humane Society family of organizations is that when we know better, we do better. And that is they are sentient beings. These animals deserve protection in their own right. And I think to the point of, when talking about what do we value, and that being sort of a key part of evaluating risk, is also just valuing animals as fellow sentient beings on this planet. And then we know from more of a strategic standpoint that not protecting animals in disasters often interferes with our humanitarian response. Many times people go back or don't evacuate because they are not able to take their animals. We learned this really the hard way in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, where research afterwards showed that about 40% of people did not evacuate when they could have because they weren't able to bring their animals with them. And as I'm so pleased that's been already very much talked about in the previous discussions, is that the human-animal bond is so critical for resilience, both for the animals and humans. And I think this is becoming far more well-known. And while it's a bit more intuitive with companion animals, we're seeing this in livestock as well. And while there might be an economic cost to losing livestock to a disaster, there's more than that. And we're actually starting some research, especially in India, to really show the psycho and social impacts of losing animals, even if the economic value is going to be replaced. And just to kind of give an example, as we know, in February, there was a horrible earthquake in Türkiye and in Syria. And we spent about 3 weeks there during search and rescue, which largely was trying to find people's lost pets when they were tragically separated during this disaster. And so one of the cases was Layla in Iskenderun, which is just about an hour away from Antakya, which was the core area where we were doing our work. And we would get locations like this, and we would be asked to please go and see if we can find their animals. We drove the hour multiple times a day for many days, trying to get to, you can see here on where Layla's house was, to see if we could find Layla. And it was very difficult. At first, we were not sure if she had even survived. We were able to one night see that she was indeed still alive, but terrified and taking refuge in her house. And her owner had been evacuated to Istanbul because she had broken her leg jumping out of the building as it was collapsing, which she told me later was she was only able to do because Layla had woken her up just minutes before the earthquake struck. And so one of the things we learned that was a really good tool was to ask
Leyla, Leyla,
from the owner.
Leyla. Al kızım. Ah, Leyla. Gel. Leyla. Leyla.
And we, oops, are you able to hear me? Okay, sorry, I got a notice that I was muted. We were able to play those recordings as a way to coax these animals out from where they were really terrified. And you might ask, why didn't we just set traps? It was really difficult with a number of street animals to be able to set traps efficiently and catch the target animals. So this became a really great way to be able to capture and reunite pets with their owners. And I think not only was it just a great tool, but it actually just proved how strong that bond is for both people and the animals. And I recently saw Layla and Rumi, her owner here, who have both recovered and are back in Iskenderun just a few weeks ago and in Türkiye. So what is our role in disaster management? Obviously, we do quite a bit of response work, but we also are looking at how we can reduce risk, prevent suffering, and improve resiliency. We work with communities and stakeholders, from governments to veterinarians to humanitarian groups, to try to develop full plans that are able to serve anyone. We truly really care about all animals, and so we don't just focus on the companion animals, but also farm animals and, of course, wildlife. And we truly believe in the power of partnerships. We can't do this by ourselves, and there's, as you can see, so much work needed around the world that we really, everywhere we go, we try to seek out relationships with local groups and other INGOs or governments to amplify the work that we're all trying to achieve. So during responses, as I mentioned, we do search and rescue. We also provide temporary sheltering, particularly in the US or in areas where this is an effective measure. We have found that in some places it's not the best way to do a response. So we try to be very conscious about what our impact and our activities and how they're going to play into the long-term recovery of a community. Especially in the US, we're finding far more needs in just providing community relief and local support to help people and organizations recover. Thankfully, there has been some changes since Hurricane Katrina, and that many animals are evacuated with their people. And so there are fewer needs for some of that direct rescue work. And so our role has shifted a bit into making sure that people are able to stay with their animals as they recover during that phase. Working with shelters in the US, we also do some pre-storm relocation. If there are shelters in the path of storms that either may not have a facility that is able to withstand the potential damage, or that is able, will play a key role in their community post-storm, we want to remove all the adoptable animals to areas that are not going to be impacted, and hope that they can seek adoption with our shelter and rescue partners in other parts of the US, allowing the shelter that will be impacted to focus solely on the needs and providing community support after the storm passes. And of course, reunification is something that we truly believe it should always be a priority when dealing with any sort of owned animals. And we saw this quite a bit in Hurricane Ian, which hit last September in 2022. And we ended up responding to one of the more underserved communities in Florida, which was Charlotte County. We set up a point of distribution center to provide pet food and other supplies as people lost pretty much everything. And then we also realized there was a significant need to provide free veterinary care for people who may have never even had their animals see a vet prior to, because of limited access to care. So I'm going to play a small video, just the way that my screen sharing showed up. Please just unmute yourself and let me know if this is not coming through properly.
We've just been so grateful to be able to be here to help.
It's a struggle here, but we won't go anywhere without him. He's our family. So we're really grateful that you guys are here.
You're gonna make me tear up.
It's a true story.
The hurricane was one of the worst that's come through the state in decades. Charlotte County was one of the most affected areas. We've sort of called it the Forgotten County. It's an area where there's communities that are already underserved. We decided to put up a point of distribution, pet food, supplies, and anything else that people needed. More than 600 cars a day were coming through our. So many people lost their homes, and so we are just providing this free service, and we just want to do our best to make sure that people can stay with their animals, that they don't have to give them up just because they can't afford to feed them right now. We're so grateful to the Charlotte County Department of Animal Services and the Animal Control Unit that asked us to come out and have been working side by side with us since the beginning. And we are committed to this county, to this area, to keep working on the recovery process and for future storms.
Oops. Okay, so we know that obviously response is going to be always part of our work, but we're trying really hard to work with organizations and communities to better prepare and plan for potential disasters. And so we definitely strive to work with especially animal shelters or other community groups to consider what their likely hazards are, what those impacts might look like, and to develop plans. What their role will be in a disaster response, and what actions can they take now to try to reduce any significant impact. That can be creating SOPs or other trainings that need to be taken, and how will their team coordinate not only externally but internally as well. What are the other key stakeholders that they should be coordinating with? We find that there's lots of local, state, and national stakeholders that are really important to engage, especially prior to a disaster. And I think, especially to Beth's point about donations, we are still continuing to find this to be not always a challenging thing to deal with, and significant donations coming in that may not always be particularly useful and often go to waste. And so we're really trying to look ahead and focus on what are the donation needs and how to best manage them. So I'm looking forward to hopefully speaking with Beth about that more at some point. Again, making sure that when an organization considers their own response, they're thinking about how is that going to fit in with the local animal control, police department, fire, and other emergency management agencies, and that is all it's complementary and works well together. And then, of course, training and practicing. You have to practice these things. We really push on trying to do drills, at least tabletops, to really play it out and see how well this is going to work when a disaster strikes, because nothing is going to be perfect. And knowing how to be flexible and adaptive to whatever is in front of you is really critically important. And to that point, we're doing a lot more work in disaster risk reduction and looking at what we could have done if we had foreseen a particular disaster, and what we could do to help communities plan ahead. So in Guatemala, we've been actively working to create an animal protocol for animals and disasters that is done through the national government. And this protocol was the first step in really getting animals on the radar for when disasters did strike. And when Volcano Pacaya erupted in 2001, we were able to provide some support to the community that was closest to the lava flows, which you can see here on the left hand. It came about 200 meters from the closest house at that community, but it still devastated grazing lands and farming land, and nearly risked the lives of many people and animals. And so we worked together with them to in 2022 to develop early warning systems, and then actually conducted a drill with the whole community and the different stakeholders from both the national, local, and provincial governments and the Veterinary Association to be able to coordinate what it would look like in the event that early warning system goes off in the future, and that everyone knew their role, and we practiced it out, including with the animals.
Guatemala is considered a highly vulnerable country to natural disasters. Every year, this region faces several events such as hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and floods. During 2021, the geothermal activity at the Pacaya volcano threatened its surroundings, exposing the high risk in which the neighboring communities find themselves. In 2019, the Guatemalan authorities approved a response protocol for the care of animals in disasters, which contemplates a preparation phase for communities with potential risk. Among these communities is the village of San José del Rodeo in San Vicente Pacaya, Escuintla. In May 2022, Humane Society International Latin America and Equinos Sanos para el Pueblo Foundation, in coordination with local authorities, carried out a drill exercise in order to prepare the San José del Rodeo community for a potential volcanic eruption. Experts from the HSI disaster team observed the activity and proposed recommendations. For the first time in Guatemala, companion and farm animals were contemplated in this process. They will directly benefit the animal and will allow the inhabitants to recover faster from the effects of the disaster, thus understanding that human and animal health are closely related.
Fue una actividad de mucho beneficio y mucha experiencia para todos como comunidad, porque esto pues puede ser útil en un momento preciso, porque estamos en un área de desastre que en cualquier momento se nos pueda presentar la ocasión. Y ya con esto que aprendimos pues es un gran paso para cuando sea necesario que no tengamos que usar esta experiencia.
Hi, I'm Kelly Donathan. I'm the Director of Animal Disaster Response for Humane Society International. And we're here right now at the foothills of Volcano Pacaya, which is here in Guatemala. And we just finished a disaster drill for the potential explosion or eruption of this volcano, which remains to be quite active and actually erupted even just last year. And this type of work, doing preparedness and mitigation with communities, is so incredibly important to what we do all over the world.
Mi nombre es Mauricio Mota, soy director de país para Humane Society International en Guatemala. El día de hoy estamos en la comunidad de San José del Rodeo, en San Vicente Pacaya, Escuintla, finalizando la actividad de un simulacro para el rescate de animales en caso de una erupción volcánica. Este proyecto pues es realizado por la Fundación Equinos Sanos para el Pueblo con el apoyo de Humane Society International y tiene como fin hacer una preparación a la comunidad en caso de algún desastre, ¿verdad? Que no solo pues salven a los seres humanos, sino también a los animales.
At HSI, we support the care of animals in disasters since we consider them important members of affected communities. The interrelation between humans and animals is a fundamental part of this community's resilience. This is why we support those most vulnerable to disasters, such as the case of the San José del Rodeo village. By caring for farm and companion animals in events like volcanic eruptions, we are helping communities recover faster from the impact of disasters.
I apologize, not all the subtitles came through on that. And I also apologize you've had to hear me twice in the videos. Thankfully, we are quickly expanding our capacity and have increasing teams throughout the world that are doing incredible work, like in India, where a lot of our community-based preparedness work is happening, and especially in the western state of Kerala, which regularly is impacted by significant floods. And so by working both with the local government, the schools, and different other agencies, they've been doing a lot of work to prepare not only the communities themselves, but also discuss with other disaster management authorities there of how they can include animals, not only for the animals' sake, but for people. We constantly have come across communities where the whole families have been lost because they would not leave without their livestock. And right now there has not been any way, any place to shelter those livestock when a potential disaster is coming. And so we have been working with them to look at the different human shelter sites that are already identified and operated during disasters in Kerala. And then also looking at the animal, both livestock and companion animal populations, as well as other risk factors such as in evacuation routes and capacity to see where we can identify where these animal shelters can be co-located along with the human shelters, so that people have a plan and a place to be able to bring their animals to, as well as support from the from our HSI team in India, as well as the local authorities, to help people get their animals to a safe place and allow them to also seek shelter themselves and get them out of the path of these hazards. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about, it's already again been mentioned a bit about multi-hazards. Nowadays, things are not happening in isolation. We have lots of hazards that are ongoing long-term, like perpetual drought in Eastern Africa, and how it's not something that we can easily respond to. We are providing some supplementary food and water for certain wildlife and livestock, but that's not truly the most sustainable operation. And so we're trying to think about both what other hazards can be coming along and what kind of anticipatory action can we do to help mitigate some of this risk and impact. The drought is not surprisingly causing an increase in human wildlife conflict, especially along the Tana River, which is really the only real source of water for the wildlife, and of course where farmers prefer to farm their crops so that they can bring that water in from the river. And so especially mango trees, the flowers are a delicacy for the giraffe, which are a endangered species in that area, and they will to implement as soon as necessary. So I hope I didn't go too long. We absolutely love partnerships. I again thank you so much in the other panels speakers today, and I hope we'll hear from many of you and what you're doing and how maybe we can work together.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Kelly. And thank you for sharing those videos and especially sharing all those stories with us. They are the reasons why we do these things and why this is so important. And yes, when we want to know better, I think that's when we do better. So thank you for that. I will now hand over to Dr. Steve Blassie.
Excellent. Now it's my time to get the technology working. So please hold. Your call is important to us. Right. Share my screen. Let's see what we can do here.
It's all good. Tech problems happen all the time. We just have to be flexible.
Now, is that coming up or looking all good if I go to that view? Can you see the main screen? Is that working?
I don't see it yet.
Oh, that's not a good sign.
No, we're not seeing anything, Steve. Keep trying. Another button.
Stand by.
It's all good. This is normally how it happens in disasters as well. Be ready for everything.
Always a crisis. All right, let's see what we can do here. Screen 2. Oh, here we go. This is another button I'll try. Let's see if this one works. Does that work?
It works.
All right, okay. Okay, so look, thanks everyone, and it's been great hearing from Amanda, Beth and Kelly, who are just fantastic experts to share this panel with, and also our other speakers as well. So Ultimush was kind enough to invite me to have a quick talk about animal disaster management law. I'll do that with a New Zealand perspective, but also referencing some international examples as well. So for those that don't know it, New Zealand's at the top of the world, or down under is in some people's orientation of the World Atlas. And we're not part of Australia, even though Beth and Amanda may claim credit to New Zealand maybe occasionally, or at least our pavlova or our racehorses. But nevertheless, we're our own country, although at one stage we were part of New South Wales for a few months, which we generally deny. Anyhow, you may remember New Zealand or know New Zealand from the Hobbits. We're generally more famous now about hobbits than what we are from sheep. But a few years ago, during the Kaikoura earthquake, the world held its breath, wondering about the fate of the 3 cows that were stuck on this landslide-created island. And yes, they were all safely saved, but that was, I think, one of the key BBC stories. People were more worried about the animals than what they were of people. So this is why animals can be important. There's geopolitical considerations or perceptions people can have of one's country based on how they manage and treat animals in disasters. So if we look at the New Zealand Animal Disaster Management Framework, it's really across 2 key pieces of legislation. There's a disaster management legislation, the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act, and also the Animal Welfare Act. So for those in the US, the Robert T. Stafford Act is like our Emergency Management Act, and under that act creates subordinate legislation such as the National Civil Defence Plan Order. So New Zealand has a bit of a fragmented and it doesn't have an animal inclusive animal disaster or animal disaster management framework. And that's one thing that I and others have been trying to advocate for. You would think that learning the lessons of the US, as Kelly mentioned, the Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and the impacts that had on not just animal safety, but also human safety, the need for specific legislation was passed. And that was passed in the following year. So many years on, New Zealand still hasn't created any such similar laws. The current legislation in New Zealand is actually under review, and there's actually an opportunity for New Zealand to do some bold leadership and actually pull together all the bits of what a good disaster management framework that's inclusive of animals should look like. And hopefully that could be something that we could hold up to the rest of the world as a model act. But it has all these vagaries of principles which are not enforceable. So unlike the PETS Act in the US, there's nothing really that's really solid. It has these unenforceable principles. The funding's not tied to it. It's got quite inconsistent powers, emergency powers. Some powers you can do for the protection of human life, some are just for life. What does life mean? If in other sections we're saying human life, does that mean there's actually 2 types of life? Is sentient life? It raises a whole ranges of issues. Probably sort of note, the most highly vulnerable animals are the most exposed. So even if we look at the PETS Act was principally there for the protection of humans because of the human-animal bond. But it's the animals that don't have that bond that are usually most vulnerable. So if we look at Amanda's ecosystem of animals humans being part of the ecosystem, not the top of the ecosystem, we've got a lot of work to do. So recently in the US, there's obviously been a new rule that's come out that basically makes animals in facilities that they have to have contingency plans and training for. No one's responsible for actually carrying out animal rescues and disasters in New Zealand. So there's a coordination function, but the coordination function doesn't actually have fire and emergency at the table, which was going back to what Kelly was saying, are your plans on board with the fire agencies, the police agencies, etc. So we have a very animal agricultural focus to animal disaster management. We don't even have the Department of Conservation, which is essentially parks and wildlife, at the table either. So when you look at Australia, they lost 3 billion animals, in particular wildlife. New Zealand, we don't even have those government agencies at or mandated in any of our plans, which, with climate change is going to become a real issue. There's areas of law, and we've got this unbridled power that officials can just destroy animals as they deem fit. with legal protections. It was in 1994, I think it was, I reviewed a health emergency management plan for civil defence, and it spoke about animals, and it said that in a big disaster, we may be competing, humans may compete for food with companion animals. So one of the treatment strategies was to destroy all companion animals. Now, I don't know about you, but it was probably about 15 or even 20 years ago that I tried a can of Pal Meaty Bites, and I can assure you I'm pretty happy to leave that for my dog to have. Rather salty and quite displeasant, really. Anyway, plans have been developed, but they've got no legal status. They've got the same legal status as a post-it note. There are instruments in New Zealand law and the emergency management law that if you create plans, you can have them incorporated by reference, which means they become legally binding, they become enforceable. In fact, it's an offence to not comply with a civil defence plan. So we had these plans that were written, but because they were animals, they weren't afforded the same protections or status. So we have all these nice to haves with no real guts behind it. So myself and others have been sort of quite concerned, in terms of, New Zealand's opportunity not really taken up to create world-leading legislation. Now, it's interesting because for some time, New Zealand's quite keen to go and tell the world we're world-leading in animal welfare. That may have been the case 20 years ago, but the World Animal Protection Index, we rank as a C. We're on par with Mexico, India. So we're not actually world leaders in animal welfare at all. But we can be, and that's where we can take the sort of positive direction. So originally 2010 is when a report was some of the first research that I did, provided a report to government. It was like, yes, thanks for your feedback. Nothing happened. We had Hurricane Katrina that fed into that report. We had a number of disasters in New Zealand. There was a ministerial review on emergency management. So it's basically like FEMA doing a review of FEMA and their arrangements. 10% of submissions raised concerns about animals. But the reviewer, who I met as the CEO of Wellington SPCA, first of all said he didn't like animals. So they were relegated to as an annex that could be worth consideration at a later point. So we pulled in the big guns, and we pulled in Craig Fugate. And I'm sure Kelly and others will know Craig Fugate, but he was the former administrator with FEMA and responsible for a lot of the reforms post-Katrina. So he came in to actually help support a significant report around legal reform. And we thought, well, if you've got to be pretty impressive to say that you know more about emergency management than Craig Fugate, but apparently some people did. So nothing happened really there. We had a national disaster resilience strategy. I used to work for the government agency responsible for their strategies, and I know how many people don't make a submission on the National Disaster Resilience Strategy. I think there's like 40 when I was there at the ministry. We managed to gain over 100 submissions. It was the largest amount of public submissions ever for a disaster resilience strategy in New Zealand history. There was no change. So here we are in 2023. There's a trifecta project which brings together the emergency management legislation, the strategy, and the plan, and submissions close on the 3rd. So a charity that I'm patron of has been undertaking a campaign to get No Animal Left Behind, and you can sort of see there's a whole bunch of sort of podcasts and media interviews, etc. Essentially, we've become so passionate / frustrated about the lack of animal inclusive legislation that as a charity we've actually stopped doing response. We've said it's unsustainable, it's not scalable, and animals are going to suffer in their tens of thousands our responses, we may save hundreds maybe or dozens of animals. So we're actually best to put our focus into the more comprehensive approach that Kelly was talking about. It's got to be more than just response. It's got to be about the disaster risk reduction. So in effect, we have basically emptied our charities' bank accounts into a national media campaign to get change. So when we look at law, because in all reality, governments only really do things if they're required to do it, because if they're not required to do it, then it's not really appropriate then to use taxpayers or public funds on something that they actually aren't obligated to do. So it's critical that we work in, that everyone sees the value in championing change at a legislative level, because we can actually save more animals through prevention. So to give you an idea, the report that I wrote in 2010, there was 34 pages. The report from Wellington SPCA, while I was their CEO on the National Civil Defence Review, 14 pages. The report that went to Parliament, 45 pages. Heck, I even did a PhD thesis, 280 pages. And so we have a government department, the Minister of Primary Industries, because it's not seen as a cross-cutting issue. It's seen as that this is an agricultural problem, it's an agricultural thing, but animals aren't. They're across all aspects of society. However, the Ministry for Primary Industries in New Zealand is responsible for providing government advice to the government on animal welfare and emergency. And in their submission to the trifecta or the Emergency Management Bill, 1.3 pages. That was what our government agency with 3,600 people put forward for how we could improve animal disaster management law in New Zealand. It's pretty underwhelming. It's one of the reasons why ourselves and other charities in New Zealand have been calling for a commissioner for animals, because it's obvious that we've got a system that's not working in the best interests of animals. So what do we need? Well, we need to have greater accountability and transparency. There is a international panel of animal disaster management, international panel for animal disaster management law that's being formed, and there's a QR code down there which I'd encourage everyone and any listeners, viewers to participate in as well. There is a model act for animal welfare that was developed in 2016. But the idea is that, and I've been speaking to Ultimush about this, is yes, we can keep going out there and responding and doing our sort of thing, but it's actually not sustainable, especially with the amount of disasters on the increase. We've got to get way before anything's happening. We've got to make animals a greater focus in DRR. So if we have a model act, that means we can actually finally measure governments and states against one another in terms of their progress, and we can track progress. But unless we have like an animal protection index, now there's an animal protection index developed by World Animal Protection. Again, it makes sort of sense to use that as the baseline and then have some supplementary metrics for animal disaster management, just like having a specific model act for animal disaster management that builds on the existing model Animal Welfare Act. But it's really important that we start to see the mainstream of animals in disaster management. This is not an ag issue. This is not a save the fluffy bunny rabbit kind of campaign. Animals are intrinsically linked into people's psychosocial well-being, their livelihoods, their economic sort of interests, their psychosocial well-being. There's so many aspects why it's really important. So if we have some tools where we can actually start to say, well, where does New Zealand sit? Are we world leading? Difference. So I would say there is no evidence to support the notion that New Zealand has world-leading animal disaster management legislation. but it does have the opportunity in the coming months to create world-leading inclusive animal disaster management laws as part of wider emergency management reform. And just in the last few days, New Zealand has voted for change and we have a new elected government. And we have MPs like Chris Bishop here, who's a local MP here in Wellington, who is absolutely nuts about his dog as well. So we're hoping that we'll be able to find that now that we've got a change in government, will we get some members of parliament that are more open to doing the right thing and putting forward a better framework to protect both humans and animals. So hopefully we can develop something that the rest of the world can lever off. And there we have it. I am done. Over to you, next caller.
Dr. Steve, thank you so much for that. That was very insightful. And actually, my presentation is going to answer a few of the questions that you raised. So just 30 minutes. But thank you so much for your presentation. And now I'll hand over to our last speaker before me, Varnika from India.
Thank you, Altamash. So can I share my... Is it visible?
I can see a part of it. Now it's good. Yeah.
So hello everyone, distinguished guests and fellow participants. As the final speaker in today's discussion on the impact of natural disasters, I will turn the attention to a facet of these catastrophic events that often remains overshadowed within the construct of India. While natural disasters inflict widespread devastation on human lives and infrastructure, the repercussions are equally severe for the animal kingdom. Like, for instance, if I have to give the example, in northeastern state of India called Assam lies a Kaziranga National Park, which is home to a significant population of the one-horned rhinoceros. And each year there is a river in Assam called Brahmaputra. Each year in that river, floods come that result in displacement of and loss of lives of both humans and animals. This national park is known for its rich biodiversity, and it faces a daunting task in protecting its inhabitants, including the one-horned rhinoceros. So in this discussion, I will explore the existing laws and policies that put forth to address these challenges and ensure the welfare of our animal counterparts in times of these crises. So India in the past has witnessed many natural disasters like Odisha super cyclone in 1999, Gujarat earthquake in 2001, Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. There were drought in 10 states in 2015 and 2016, which estimated 330 million people were affected. And recently, this year, there were floods in the northern part of India, the mountain area or states of Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. And in August 2018, in the state of Kerala, which is the southernmost state of India, there was excessive rainfall due to which it led to floods and landslides. And as per the data of the Disaster Management Authority of the state government, this resulted in the death of large number of cattle, goats, and poultry. There was destruction of cattle sheds, shortage of fodder, vet services, and vaccines. The flood resulted in death of 40,188 large animals, 765 small animals. Also, every year, number of humans and animals dies or displaced in river Brahmaputra, as I said earlier, in the Assam. So I have some data in that context. In the year 2020, more than 100 wild animals died in Kaziranga National Park. And in the year 2022, 48 lakh people and 33 lakh animals got affected. This year in 2023, 1.20 lakh people in 20 districts of the state have been affected, and over 1 lakh domestic animals and poultry have also been affected in the first spell of the floods. Further, if I talk about for this year for Kaziranga National Park, 9 animals died there. And other than these big disasters which comes in international news, there are also small disasters which goes unnoticed. So these incidents, while not as widespread, are also devastating, and they have effect on the communities involved. So recently, such a small level disaster happened in July 2023 in the National Capital Region of India, the New Delhi area it is called, and there's a river Yamuna. So it was not a natural disaster at all. It was a man-made disaster because there was so much rain this year. So the doors of the dams were opened without giving any warning to the local people who were living at the nearby area. And because of that, there was extra flooding. So these are some of the pictures of saving the animals by FIAPO, the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organization. And so I think it is important to recognize all kind of disasters that are taking place, whether they are small scale or whether they are large scale. If I give a bit of statistics on the frequency of disasters has increased tremendously over the last decade. According to the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, 432 disasters occurred in 2021, whereas in comparison, the average number of disasters for the 20-year period from 2001 to 2022 was 347. Among all continents, Asia was the worst hit with 40% of the disaster share. And India has witnessed 191 disasters in the past 11 years. So what is the geoclimatic condition of India? I would like to put light on that. It has, India is vulnerable to disasters, and it is in varying degrees to floods, droughts, cyclones, tsunamis, earthquake, urban flooding, landslides, avalanches, and forest fire. So there are 28 states and 8 union territories in the country, out of which 27 are disaster prone. 58.6% landmarks is prone to earthquakes of moderate to very high density. 12% land is prone to flood and river erosion. And 68% of the cultivable land is vulnerable to drought. Hilly areas are at risk from landslides and avalanches, and 15% of the landmass is prone to landslides. So having said that, there is an act, if I come to policy and legislation, there is an act for disaster management, which is called the Disaster Management Act of 2005. It was enforced after the Indian Ocean tsunami, which came in 2004. And the objective of the act is to provide for the effective management of disasters and for matters connected therewith. So, but the important point to note is that this act do not cover animals in the scenario, but it has included some like important definitions of capacity building. It defines disaster management. It also includes for a national level plan on disaster management. It includes to make authorities within the states, because India is a quasi-federal country, so states also have their role, and at the national level, like this act is on the national level, but the states can adopt this act. So if there will be a national plan under this act, either that can be adopted at the state level, or a state can also come up with their different disaster plan. So this national plan includes key aspects like it emphasizes for disaster prevention, mitigation, integration into development plans. It highlights preparedness, capacity building, and the roles of various government ministries. Then there is also National Disaster Management Policy. So in this policy, under the chapter 7, the animals have been covered. What it says that is it is necessary to devise appropriate measures to protect animals and find means to shelter and feed them during disasters and their aftermath through a community effort to the extent possible. So, and also under its chapter 5, which refers to climate change, it has recognized animal health. It states that climate change is impacting our glacial reserves, water balance, agriculture, forestry, coastal ecology, biodiversity, and human and animal health. So, though animals have been slowly being recognized, but the problem is again the enforcement, because when we see the disasters that are occurring, there is no planning and the situation is really bad for both humans and animals for rescue. And if I talk about National Disaster Management Plan, so National Disaster Management Plan covers, it is in consonance with the Sendai framework for disaster management. It includes several hazard disasters like thunderstorm, lightning, squall, dust, strong wind, cloudburst, hailstorms, glacier lake outburst, flood, heat wave, biological and public health emergencies. And it also includes climate change risk management as new thematic area for the climate risk. This plan also includes recognized animals. This plan has included search and rescue of animals in preparedness and response during disaster. It guides on different aspects on disposal of animal carcasses, evacuation of people and animals, fodder for livestock in scarcity hit areas, rescue of animals in fore and emergency services. And then there is a do's and don'ts by the National Disaster Management Authority. So it is a document where few of the disasters have been mentioned, and it is told that how humans shall behave and how they should be prepared for these disasters. So under one of the disaster during thunderstorm, dust storm, and squall, do's and don'ts for animals have been recognized. And it states that during thunderstorm, dust storm, and squall, the animals shall be designated a safe area in or near the house to shelter your animals in a severe thunderstorm. The animals shall be kept away from open water pond or river. They should be away from tractors and other matter farm equipment. They shouldn't be allowed under the trees, and they should be closely like they should be under direct control. So this is the structure of policy and legislation, but however, this is majorly on papers. And during the recent 2023, the Noida floods, which I talked about, the Yamuna floods, because I also helped on the ground during this disaster, and the situation was really bad. We were not prepared for this because no warning was given by the government, and a whole of a residential area, a farmhouses area, was under the water. There were pets in those area, and then the people had just ran away. So we were rescuing those pets as much as we can because there was no space to go inside much. And after that, not only in that area, the other localities, the street dogs were rescued. They were filled up in the truck, and then they were sent to some shelters, and most of the nearby shelters were already filled, so they were sent to another city. However, there was no help regarding the handling of these street dogs. The way they were filled under the truck was not right, but still this work was not done by any government agency, but this work, as much as the NGOs could, they try to help. So even though animals are being recognized, there is Disaster Management Act. The problem which lies is the enforcement. So therefore, what is the way forward and what are the challenges? Why even after few of the policies in place, still there is no readiness during these disasters? So few challenges are limited resources, limited awareness, lack of training, lack of coordination. There are limited resources. There is really scarce funds. There's manpower, equipment hinders swift responses, even for both human and animals. The main thing is there's no adequate funding, and also there is not much of awareness within the community about the importance of animal welfare during such disasters. Even it is seen that sometimes the owner of the animal leave the animal there, and if somebody is not coming, there are chances that that dog or cat won't survive. So for this, training programs and workshops are really required, and people are required to educate. And there is also, in such disasters, what happens is there is a lot of lack of coordination among the stakeholders between the animal NGOs, the rehabilitation centers. So if it would be better if there is effective communication and collaboration between organizations, government, volunteers, so that a prompt action can be taken. And to do this, what can be done as per my limited knowledge, what I can think of is that tools and guidelines are required for risk assessment. Proper evaluation methods help identifying vulnerable animal population, enabling targeted rescue and aid efforts. So these resources like aid emergency responders, veterinarians, and policy makers in understanding the scale of impact, guiding efficient allocation of resources is what is required. So like we can learn from one of the disaster and can be ready now for another disaster if something like that happens again, because there are a lot of rains every year now, and the frequency of rains and the flood is increasing. So there are always chances that there could be flood. So now we have seen this year, we can be, we can take the data and we can be more prepared for it. Proactive approach is what is required. And there should be standard operating guidelines for animal evacuation. For rescue, there should be clear protocols to ensure systematic planning, efficient rescue operations, and safe shelter for animals. And there should be research and exploration more. So there is almost no research on how to rescue animals during these explorations. So the plans with which the government has come, like the national plan or the national policy, more discussion is needed with the government so that the experts in this field can tell the government what kind of plan should they come up, both for humans and animals, because it is only not animals, but the situation is not that good for humans also. Though yes, they are the first priority, they are saved, but still better response can be made if we do it with much more preparedness. So this is my presentation regarding this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Varnika, and for the work that you are doing. I'll just take over from here, speak about just 15 minutes, just bringing all these thoughts together, because I had predicted this, and I think all of you also predicted it as well, but I think it will make sense now. Can everybody see this? Perfect. So, I mean, in the presentations that we heard today, something is always missing, you know. We say that response is important, but then we say that it's not enough unless we have legislative change. Then we have legislative change in some countries, but that still is not enough because we're missing something else. Like, for example, as Beth mentioned, we do not have this green humanitarian kind of response, and we basically don't look for climate risks either before disasters or within disasters. So it feels like what's really missing, or what we really need to see is actually how the whole framework, like what is a disaster prevention framework and what kind of things actually come inside it are some things that we really need to see. So my attempt is actually to bring forth or create some kind of a roadmap or a map actually to see what actually is a part of disaster prevention framework, even though we might not consider it as a de facto part, but as a de jure part, it's actually really relevant. So one of the major reasons actually why we are not able to advance animal welfare, particularly in the disaster framework, is most of the language, like the words that we use, you know, resilience or vulnerability or hazards, we use them in a sense that's very pro animal welfare and pro climate change. But the thing is, the way these words are actually defined in, for example, the Sendai framework, which is the non-binding international legal resolution on disaster framework, does not include animals at all. It basically defines disasters or hazards in which animal loss is actually considered as property damage. That's not, and that basically has a huge impact on, even if we make domestic changes, there's something missing. There's something that we need to see. And same is the case with vulnerability or even resilience. It's just that the terms that are used, for example, vulnerability is defined as a community. And if you actually go to Google or just look up in your simple definitions, the term community is mostly restricted to human beings, and animals are actually kept out of it. And that is the same way we define resilience as well. And this actually has a huge impact, and it becomes kind of a driver for anthropocentrism and leaving animals out, even though we are, like, you know, with our fullest intentions trying to bring things together. So I believe that's one really important factor that we need to acknowledge and understand. And the Sendai frameworks particularly, their goal actually is substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in livelihoods and health. The term animal is again not used. The term livelihood is used, basically implying that the association or animals inherent, you know, intrinsic value, what do we value exactly, comes from the human side of things, and that basically aggravates more anthropocentrism. But even though the goal is good, which is something that I find is something that's not aligning with the current structure that we have in the Sendai framework. For example, the goal says that we have to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk. We have to increase preparedness for response and recovery, and we have to prevent and reduce hazard exposures. But the thing is, if we fail to include animals, we are basically not considering them as a kind of a factor when we evaluate our other activities that can be linked to increasing disaster risk. For example, factory farming, placing animals in a layered system, basically a very disastrous infrastructure. Like, for example, an earthquake happens and there's, if you can imagine, a layered system where there's chicken over chicken in cages. When a disaster will happen, the impact on those animals will be much more severe, rather than having a free cage system. But the thing is, when we basically exclude animals from these kind of situations, the pre-disaster, in some words, environmental impact assessment, or some kind of an idea where we're trying to acknowledge or understand what kind of risk or, you know, can this kind of a project create. But we would not include those animal factors there as well. and those would eventually flow and make it actually harder, and in other words, impossible to achieve the goal of the Sendai frameworks. And a really good example of this is the aquatic system. And this is just common sense, but the fact that humans cannot live underwater leads to like a complete ignorance of aquatic disasters and its impact on animals and humans. I would categorize this as this, this lack of human-animal bond, and that actually flows. And a good example of this, actually positive example of this aquatic system welfare reform, some kind of, is what happened in New Zealand a couple of years ago when there was this Gulf Livestock One cruise that basically drowned, and that led to a death of 6,000 cattle. That caused massive effects on the aquatic system. But as a result, New Zealand basically started this new policy of banning live animal export. In a way, I believe that this banning of live animal export and the linkage that it has to decrease risks and basically help us achieve the goals makes all of these policies, these welfare policies, these nature policies, these climate policies, a part of the disaster prevention framework. And we have to basically see the full map if we want to basically envision an animal protection matrix. And for this, I believe we need to look at 5 things. Number 1 is the why behind animal protection measures. Number 2 is pro-animal protection measures, which is basically stronger reforms. And then there's the risks that are increasing these measures. And lastly, the most important part, which we in some ways ignore, is the status of animals in legal systems in domestic countries. And lastly, the 5th one, which is, I would say, pretty much absent everywhere, is stakeholder accountability. Like, if you violate this act, who's responsible? So if we go through these things, the why mostly behind animal protection measures is the human-animal bond. And the thing is, companion animals benefit from it is from the side of the human side of the human-animal bond. And that is the reason why, even though farmers develop this kind of a human-animal bond with farmed animals as well, but the thing is, that does not lead to protection for farm animals, because the farm animals in those cases are actually more confined to the animal end of that bond, and the human value is actually missing. And that's one of the main reasons why we only have protection for companion animals, and that's very restricted. In a way, we only have a disaster prevention framework for companion animals, and the failure to include other animals specifically creates further risk and basically causes more disasters and more animal deaths and even more human deaths. In examples for pro-animal protection measures I know mostly about these from the US, so I mentioned these, which was the PETS Act. The main reason behind it was protecting the human-animal bond. Then there was the new act that was passed 2 years ago, actually 1 year ago, the Planning for Animal Wellness Act, which basically created these experts groups to basically review how these the funding has to be given, or like how these disaster protection matrix has to be created. The third one that I really like, and that really encapsulates the essence of disaster framework, is the Industrial Agriculture Accountability Act. It's not passed yet. It's very rare that it will actually pass, but the aim of this act is to basically shut down factory farming. And even though the reason is animal cruelty, but factory farming and meat production per se is responsible for 47% of the global carbon dioxide emissions, and alone responsible for 7% of global warming. The failure to include these things in our framework is actually causing more disasters and leading to more human deaths, making it even more important. A few things that are really additionally important are the risks that are increasing these measures, which is basically applying these anthropocentric standards and relegating animals to the periphery. Like, for example, if a disaster happens, or actually coming back to my previous example, like food systems, evaluation or reforms are kept outside of the disaster prevention framework, even though they should be a major chunk of it, because food systems are directly responsible for many of these disasters. Climate change and coral reefs deaths like that happen underwater, and the impact that it has on biodiversity loss is massive, but it's unrecorded because humans sadly don't live underwater, and that's a debate that we need to engage in. We have to create more protection for aquatic animals specifically in this kind of a framework as well. And lastly, animals as livelihoods means balancing human and animal lives. So even if we create the best laws, the thing is, if this status stays, we will always value human life over. And a good example of this is actually something that happened in Hurricane Katrina. So there were these evacuation transportations set up, but the thing was they were only allowed to take the humans. The animals had to be left behind. That was a major reason, and that actually flew from the idea that animals are livelihood. And that will always stay until we change these things, until we change the definitions and how we define those words. And the fourth, and I think this is the most important one, and that's something that's missing, and this actually becomes a reason for creating an animal-specific protection matrix, just as Dr. Glassy mentioned, is that we need to actually look in the domestic framework, like what's the sentient status of animals in a particular jurisdiction. There's only very few, but you can imagine if that country has a sentient status, it's going to value that animal at the same level. And if in those situations you create better laws, that will have an effect. They will not be just like nice words on paper. They will be actually implemented, and that is something we need to change. A same case is made for the property status, and I think this is the huge one. This basically makes it okay for having animal husbandry cruel practices and keeping animals away, like in times of disasters, like you have to rescue humans first. This needs to change. And then there's these welfare protection status and the environmental protection status. The environmental protection status is basically the presentations Amanda and Beth gave. I personally firmly believe that this framework is a part of disaster frameworks, and we have to look at them as a part of it and as a map. And the same case for welfare protection as well. But the thing is, they will always be meager or not have effect unless we change the first two, which is sentience and property. And perhaps we actually need to have more things to look at in these animal statuses. And lastly, the fifth thing is basically animal specific protections in domestic law. For example, Pakistan, animals in zoos, we don't have much stronger protection. Same as the case with captivity and farmed animals. It's actually reverse. We give funding. So in case a disaster happens, we give indemnity funding, and that's the same case in the US as well, which basically gives them no incentive to these farmers to save those animals. So it's anti-disaster framework. It's creating more risk. Same case for companion animals within a specific country, laboratory animals, wild animals, and liminal animals, nobody even thinks about them. But I think if we have more science, they will have a huge role to play as well. And I think an even stronger case for aquatic animals exists. The last thing, which I really want to mention, is stakeholder accountability. The thing is, if you violate the Sendai framework, which is just a non-binding resolution, nobody is responsible. And as Varnika also mentioned, in your laws in India, there's no enforcement on paper. A major reason for that is nobody is accountable if there's a violation. That needs to change across the board, actually. And I think this stakeholder accountability part should be a part of that map. Like when we see this disaster prevention, we have to look at the status, we have to look at the reasons why we are creating that law, and so on and so forth. So my recommendations actually are very simple. We need an animal-specific disaster protection matrix because every animal is individually affected, and every animal type is individually categorized in domestic frameworks as well, giving us more reason to create these things. Another thing that I recently wrote a paper on is and especially coming from an accountability perspective and adding in the biodiversity loss part, an international treaty, which may seem very ambitious, may be needed on animal rescue and international disasters, especially given the biodiversity loss that has happened. WWF basically reported 69% loss till 2018. But after 2018, we have had major disasters, 3 billion in Australia, 17 million in Brazil, and in Pakistan last year, 1 million, and so on and so forth. And the disasters that had happened this year, they're not part of the original biodiversity loss that has already happened. So maybe we are at crossroads and we need to change the way we look at things. So I just applied my framework that I created in Pakistan, and we don't have sentient status. Animals are property. In welfare protections, it's mostly cruelty. What that really means is in case an animal is hurt or some kind of cruelty happens, then there's only stakeholder accountability. There's no positive obligations to protect that animal. And so even if I create like the best disaster management law for Pakistan, we have a National Disaster Management Act, but there's no mention of animals. It would not work because these things have to be a part of it. for environmental protection, Pakistan is signatory to a few treaties like the CITES and the CMS, and that creates some protection for endangered animals. But that's also very restricted. We actually need to change that, as was clearly mentioned in Beth's and Amanda's presentation. Number 5, very important. We have weak protection for zoos, captivities for farm animals. In Islam, for example, slaughter is regulated, but the thing is, it's not implemented because there's no actual political will and nobody is accountable. For companion animals, dog culling is a major issue in my country. So with that, how am I expected to create the best disaster protection law and then basically, turn it into something that's enforceable? This is important. We need to look at it. And lastly, for stakeholder accountability, it's mostly non-existent. Nobody's responsible because that's the current framework, and we need to look at all of these things when we are basically defining some kind of a thing. I just wanted to end this on a very positive note. I'll just take 3 minutes. So there was a flood last year in my country, and we actually went in to rescue both humans and animals. We provided emergency veterinary aid and over 120,000 kilograms of animal food. We rescued 8,000 farm animals. At that point, we didn't have a space because we couldn't have waited. I mean, those animals would have died for no reason. But this year, we actually got funding from HSI, and we are this close to setting up my country's first disaster zone farm animal shelter. So the